I never thought I would live long enough to hear my own children talk about my money like I was already gone. That's a sentence I still have to say slowly. Because when it happened, I was very much alive. I was sitting right there in my living room, the old couch with the soft dip in the middle, a basket of folded laundry at my feet, late afternoon light stretching across the carpet the way it always had. It was an ordinary day, and maybe that's why it hurt more. Their voices weren't loud. No shouting, no anger, just quiet, careful, the kind of low voices people use when they think they're being smart. I remember thinking, why are they whispering in my house? That's when I heard it, not a full sentence, just my son's name followed by a pause and then a number spoken like it already belonged to someone. That was the moment my hands stopped folding the laundry. Because I realized they weren't talking to me anymore. They were talking around me, around my chair, around my presence, around the fact that I was still sitting there breathing, listening, alive. I'd spent decades saving that money, skipped trips, bought the cheaper brand, worked past the point of being tired, not to make anyone rich, just so I wouldn't be a burden, and somehow that careful saving had turned into a topic. Suddenly the questions changed. How are you feeling today, Mom? Turned into, do you still have everything written down somewhere? Did you eat lunch? Turned into, it might be easier if things were clear ahead of time. They said it kindly, with soft voices, with that polite concern that doesn't quite reach the eyes, and every time one of them mentioned money, the others went quiet. Not awkward quiet, intentional quiet, like they were waiting to see who would speak next. I kept telling myself, you're imagining this, you're being sensitive, mothers do that. But then I heard my daughter say, well, if Mom doesn't really need it, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Because that's when I understood what was happening. They weren't counting on my health. They weren't counting on my time. They weren't counting on me. They were counting what would be left when I was. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. Once you realize it's not just about money anymore, you start thinking about who you used to be before things shifted. Because I wasn't always the quiet presence in the other room. For most of my life, I was the center everything leaned on. Not the loud kind, not the demanding kind, the steady kind. If something went wrong, I handled it. If someone needed help, I found a way without making a fuss. There was always extra food in my freezer, an extra place at the table, an extra bit of patience when tempers flared. I was the one who smoothed things over between siblings, the one who answered the phone late at night, the one who made problems feel smaller just by listening. Being needed felt like love to me, and for a long time, I truly believe it was. But somewhere along the way, something quiet changed. I didn't notice it at first because nothing dramatic happened. No arguments, no slammed doors, just imbalance. I remember one afternoon my car wouldn't start. Nothing serious, just a dead battery. I called my son, no answer. I called my daughter. She said, "Can you call roadside assistance?" Her voice wasn't unkind, just distant, busy. I sat there for a moment, phone in my hand, realizing I'd never once told them to figure things out alone when they needed me. That was the first time I felt the shift. I had spent years making myself easy to rely on, strong, independent, low maintenance. And without meaning to, I think I taught them I would never need anything back. I never said, this cost me something. I never said, I might need you someday. So when the money came up, when the inheritance entered the room, they didn't see it as part of my life. They saw it as something waiting, something separate from me. That's when it hit me. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being the heart of the family and started becoming a resource. And when a family sees you that way, they don't ask how you're holding up. They ask how things will be divided. And I didn't understand how far that thinking had gone until I realized they weren't just talking about the money anymore. They were already deciding who deserved what. And once I realized they were already deciding who deserved what, I had to look straight at the thing I'd spent a lifetime not talking about. That money, the $300,000 I never mentioned, never announced, never built my life around. I didn't grow up with money. Saving it meant choosing what to go without. Trips I skipped, clothes I put back. Another maybe next year said quietly to myself, I wasn't trying to leave a prize behind. I was trying to protect my independence. I wanted to know that if I lived long enough, I wouldn't have to ask my children to take care of me. That was always the plan, so I worked, I waited, I saved quietly, and for years nobody paid it much attention. Until one afternoon, my daughter interrupted me mid-sentence and said, "Well, we'll just need to know what we're working with." That word stayed with me. After that, the questions started. Do you still have everything in one account? Would it make sense to put someone else's name on it? Timing-wise, it might be better to plan now. Not someday, not gently, now. They said it like concern, like organization, like they were helping me, but help doesn't rush you past your own voice. The moment that changed everything happened at the kitchen table. We were all there, plates still out, coffee going cold. My son had a folder in front of him. I didn't know what was in it. He spoke the most. My daughter nodded along. The other one stayed quiet, eyes on the table. They talked about being fair, about avoiding confusion later. At one point my son said, "Well, Mom wouldn't want it complicated." And he kept talking. Nobody asked me if that was true. Nobody looked at me to confirm. I felt my chest tighten, not with anger but with something colder. They had already decided I agreed. That's when the question finally formed in my mind. When did this money start mattering more to them than I did? I didn't say it out loud. I didn't interrupt. I just sat there listening to my future being organized without me. The money wasn't in the background anymore. It was sitting at the table, speaking through them. And for the first time, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. They weren't just planning ahead. They were practicing life without my say in it. And once you realize people are already practicing life without your say in it, you start noticing things you would have once brushed aside. Little changes, nothing loud, nothing you could point to without sounding unreasonable. Just shifts. The phone calls came first, quick ones. "How are you feeling today? Any appointments this week?" They didn't wait long for the answers. And I noticed something strange. They never asked follow-up questions, almost like they already knew. Visits came next. Planned, short, coats still on. They'd sit on the edge of the chair, glancing at the clock, talking about errands they needed to run. I'd offer coffee. They'd say no. I'd start a story. They'd de-smile and check their phone. Then came the reminders. My son called one afternoon and said, "You should keep all your important papers in one place from now on." Not maybe, not someday, from now on. The way he said it was calm, certain. Like a decision had already been made and I'd simply missed the meeting. But the moment that stayed with me the longest was the drawer. My daughter stood up mid-conversation, walked to the cabinet and opened it without asking. She wasn't searching. She was checking. Her hand hovered over my folders. I watched her do it like I was watching someone touch something that wasn't theirs. She smiled and said, "Oh, I was just curious. Curious enough to cross a line." And the strangest part was this: they were nicer. Polite, careful. They spoke to me the way you speak around fragile things, not cold, just distant, like my feelings mattered but my opinions didn't. That's when the unease settled in, because I wasn't being pushed aside. I was being managed, and management doesn't happen unless someone believes the decisions are no longer yours. This wasn't just concern anymore. It was preparation for a future where my voice would already be absent. And once you feel your voice starting to fade from your own life, you listen differently. You stop hearing what's being said and start noticing what's missing. The conversations changed, not the words, the tone. The concern started sounding practiced, like it came from a script they'd already agreed on before walking through the door. One afternoon, my son looked at me and said, "At your age, simplicity really matters." He said it kindly, but he didn't ask what I wanted. He said it like a conclusion. My daughter began finishing my sentences. If I started explaining something, she'd jump in and say, "Well, what Mom means is," and then she'd keep talking. I remember sitting there, hands folded in my lap, watching my own thoughts walk away without me. But the moment that finally stopped me cold was quieter than I expected. I mentioned I had an appointment the following week, just a routine checkup. My daughter said, "Oh, we already talked about that." We. She turned to her brother and said, Didn't we decide it would be better if I went with her? Decided. I hadn't been part of that conversation. They weren't asking me, they were informing me. I felt it in my chest then, that slow, sinking feeling you get when something is being taken from you without permission. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, I usually go alone. They exchanged a look. My son said, well, this just makes more sense. That's when I knew this wasn't advice anymore. This was management. I went quiet after that. Not because I agreed, but because I realized every word I said was being filtered, weighed, and corrected. Love doesn't make you feel like you need approval to live your own life. And that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I understood something I couldn't unlearn. If I didn't say something soon, they would keep deciding for me, and I wasn't sure how much of myself would be left by the time I did. After that night, I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt, not out of anger, out of clarity. I didn't discover the truth in some dramatic moment. It came quietly, the way these things always do. We were standing in the kitchen, coffee cups on the counter, sunlight warming the tile. My daughter said something about what we already agreed on. I looked up and asked, agreed on what? She hesitated, not long, just enough. Then she smiled and said, oh, nothing important. But my son didn't look at me. He stared into his cup. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. They had talked, not argued, not disagreed, just talked, the way people do when they assume the outcome is theirs. Later that afternoon, I heard my son on the phone in the hallway. He didn't know I was close enough to hear. He said my name. Then he said, yeah, we went over that already. The word we hung in the air. It didn't include me. I stood there, hand resting on the wall, feeling something firm settle into place inside my chest. This wasn't recent, and it wasn't accidental. They hadn't forgotten to include me. They had chosen not to. That's what finally broke something open. Because once you understand that the silence was intentional, you can't explain it away. I went back to my chair and sat down slowly, not stunned, resolved. All the careful conversations, the polite concern, the planning, they weren't happening with me. They were happening without me. And in that moment, I knew something else too. If I stayed quiet now, I wouldn't just be overlooked. I would be replaced in my own life. And that was a line I knew I couldn't let them cross again. And once you know there's a line you can't let them cross again, you start seeing how far they've already stepped past it. I was still there, still in my house, still making my own coffee each morning, but I had slipped out of the picture. The house felt quieter, not the peaceful kind, the empty kind. They still came by, still called, but now I noticed something that settled deep in my chest. If I didn't speak, nothing stopped. Conversations moved on without me. Plans continued. Decisions stayed made. One afternoon, I didn't offer my opinion on something they were discussing in the kitchen. I just stayed quiet. No one asked what I thought. No one noticed. That's when I understood how complete the exclusion had become. I stopped nodding after that, not out of spite, out of exhaustion. I stopped filling the silence so they wouldn't feel uncomfortable. If they spoke around me, I let them. If they referenced plans I hadn't heard about, I didn't ask to be included. I watched. Meals felt shorter. Visits ended quicker. They talked to each other more than they talked to me. Sometimes they lowered their voices when they noticed I was listening. Other times they didn't bother. And that was worse. One evening, I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock mark time. I realized something then, something that frightened me. If I disappeared into silence completely, this would keep going just the same. That's when the sadness shifted into something heavier, clarity. This wasn't a phase, it wasn't miscommunication. They weren't waiting for me to speak up, they were used to me not being part of it. And standing there in my own home, I made a quiet decision. I couldn't keep living on the outside of my own life. Something had to change. And for the first time, I understood that the next move would have to come from me. And once you accept that the next move has to come from you, you stop seeing people as good or bad. You see them as they are. That clarity changes things. I began noticing how each of my children approached the money in their own way. My oldest was careful, always reasonable, always calm. He spoke in explanations. We just want things organized. It's about avoiding problems later. He never demanded, he assumed, and that assumption was its own kind of pressure. My daughter was more direct. She didn't circle the subject. She asked clear questions, expected clear answers. How much is there now? Have you decided how it'll be split? It would be simpler if we knew. She didn't hide her interest. She believed clarity gave her permission. But the youngest, he was different. He talked about timing, about consequences, about what happens when things aren't settled soon enough. He said things like, "You don't want this dragging on," or "waiting too long can make it messy." Not once did he ask what I wanted. He spoke like time was already running out. I listened to all of them, and in that listening, something inside me shifted for good. They weren't talking to their mother anymore. They were talking like future owners waiting their turn. I let that thought sit. I didn't soften it. I didn't explain it away, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about greed alone. It was about entitlement grown comfortable in silence. And my understanding of them didn't make me more patient. It made me certain. If I stayed quiet now, this would keep moving forward without me. And I knew, with a steadiness I hadn't felt before, doing nothing was no longer an option. And once you know doing nothing is no longer an option, life has a way of making that truth impossible to ignore. I didn't hear the fight the way you hear fights on television. There was no yelling, no slammed doors. That's what made it worse. It was a normal afternoon. I was in my bedroom, sorting through old papers, deciding what to keep and what to let go. I heard their voices from the living room, low, careful. Then I heard my name. I stopped moving. My son said, "That's not what we talked about." My daughter replied, "Well, that's not fair." That word again, fair. I stayed where I was, hand resting on the dresser, listening. They weren't talking about me. They were talking about what I would leave behind. Numbers came up, not exact amounts, just pieces, shares, percentages. My youngest said, "You can't just assume that." My oldest answered, "I'm not assuming, I'm being realistic." Realistic. I took one slow breath and felt something settle deep in my chest. If I walked into that room, would they stop? I didn't test it. The voices tightened, still quiet, sharper now. My daughter said, "Well, someone has to say it." I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. In that moment, something inside me finally locked into place. Not anger, certainty. I didn't belong in that conversation. I wasn't their mother then. I was in a state. When the voices softened, when the tension eased, I turned back to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands still, heart steady. The last piece of doubt had fallen away. You don't overhear your children argue over you while you're still alive and continue pretending everything is fine. And as I sat there, listening to the house go quiet, I knew one thing for sure. The silence between us couldn't last much longer. And once you know the silence can't last much longer, you finally understand what actually hurt. It wasn't the money. I'd lived most of my life without needing much. Money was never the point. It was security, independence, the freedom to stand on my own. I could have lost every dollar and still found my footing. What hurt was realizing what I had become to them. Not a mother still living her days, not a woman with choices, but a future payout, something waiting to be divided. That realization sat heavy in my chest, because I could trace it backward through all the years I'd shown up without question. I never measured what I gave, but now they were measuring me. They spoke in numbers instead of memories, in timing instead of time together, and the truth finally settled in. They had already started mourning me while I was still alive. They had skipped past this part of my life, the part where I'm still here, still thinking, still choosing. That night I sat alone at the kitchen table. The chair across from me was empty. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine arguments. I practiced the truth. That being reduced to what you leave behind is a quiet kind of erasure. And I understood something else too. If I allowed that erasure to continue, it wouldn't stop on its own. Clarity does that to you. It strips away excuses. It removes confusion. And as I sat there, hands resting on the table, I felt grief shift into something steadier. Resolve. I wasn't ready to confront anyone yet, but I was done being invisible in my own life. And for the first time, I knew exactly what had to change next, even if they didn't know it yet. And once resolve settles in, it forces you to look at yourself honestly, not to punish yourself, to understand. I asked myself one hard question: did my giving teach them that my needs didn't matter? I had always believed that being a good mother meant being the strong one, the one who didn't ask, the one who adjusted, the one who carried more so her children could carry less. I said it's fine more times than I should have, not because it was true, but because it kept the peace. And I could admit this without shame. I had taught them how much I was willing to give, but I had never taught them where it stopped. That realization stung, but it didn't weaken me, because understanding your part doesn't mean accepting someone else's overreach. Ray. Responsibility is not permission. Reflection is not surrender. Wanting to be loved is not the same as wanting to be valued. Love listens, value measures. And I knew which one I deserved. I wasn't ashamed of how I raised my children. I was simply done paying for love with silence. From that moment on, I stopped explaining myself. I stopped softening my words to make them comfortable. I didn't announce a change, I became one. Because guilt, when faced honestly, doesn't lead you backward. It tells you exactly what you will no longer give away. And I knew, with calm certainty, I would never again trade my place in my own life for someone else's approval. And once I stopped explaining myself, the space between us grew quiet. Those weeks were lonely, not because I was alone, but because I could feel how unnecessary I'd become to them. The phone rang less. When it did, the calls were brief. It felt like courtesy, not care. Visits turned awkward. They stayed just long enough to say they'd been there. I stopped offering food. No one asked why. And in that silence, I felt something settle in, the slow realization that needing me had turned into something they wanted to avoid. "Let me know if you need anything," my daughter said once, keys already in her hand. Need meant inconvenience. I sat with that truth without chasing it away. I didn't call to fill the space. I didn't explain the quiet, I let it be. And somewhere in those weeks, something important shifted. I felt more myself than I had in a long time. I wasn't shrinking anymore to keep conversations smooth. I wasn't offering pieces of myself just to stay included. The loneliness was real, but it wasn't empty. It was honest. I spent my days simply as they were, reading, tidying what mattered, watching the light move across the floor, no performance, no permission needed. And I understood something clearly then. Being treated like a burden hurts deeply, but disappearing to be wanted hurts more. I hadn't lost my place, I had reclaimed it. I was still a mother, still a woman, still whole. And from that steadiness, I knew whatever came next would happen on my terms. And once I felt steady again, the idea came to me anyway: silence, the familiar kind, the kind that keeps things smooth when you're tired and don't want another hard moment. Peace has a certain pull when you've spent your life holding things together. I told myself I could live this way: smile politely, change the subject, let things pass. I'd done it before, for years. There's comfort in silence, but it never comes free. I thought about holidays, how quiet they could be if I didn't say anything. Birthdays, visits that wouldn't feel strained if I asked for nothing. Silence keeps the calendar calm, it keeps voices low, it keeps disappointment hidden. And for a moment, I understood the temptation. But every time that thought appeared, another truth arrived right behind it. Silence would cost me more than it ever had before. Not my money, my voice. I had already felt what happens when you step back far enough. You stop being considered, you stop being included, you stop being seen. Peace that asks you to erase yourself isn't peace, it's surrender. I sat with that truth without trying to soften it. Because this time, silence wouldn't protect anyone. It would confirm everything they already believed, that I would adjust, that I would absorb, that I would stay quiet no matter how small I was made to feel. And I knew then, with a clarity that didn't waver, I had outgrown silence. Not out of anger, not out of spite, out of self-respect. I didn't need to rehearse what I would say yet, but I knew this much for certain: I would not disappear to keep the peace. I would not trade my voice for temporary calm. That door had closed. And once silence is no longer an option, the only thing left is to stand where you are and let yourself be heard. And once silence was no longer an option, I didn't rush to speak. I didn't call anyone. I didn't sit anyone down. I made a decision quietly, for myself. There was no anger in it, no speeches, just clarity. From that moment on, I stopped waiting to be included. If a plan came up that I hadn't been part of, I didn't nod. I let the silence sit, not as punishment, as truth. I stopped explaining my choices. No long reasons, no softening. If something mattered to me, that was enough. I moved through my days differently after that. Calmer, steadier, I slept better, spoke less, but when I spoke, I meant it. This wasn't rebellion, it was return. A return to the woman I was before I learned to make myself smaller for the sake of peace. Nothing outside me needed to change first. The shift had already happened. I wasn't waiting to be understood. I wasn't asking to be handled gently. I knew where I stood. And from that place, whatever came next would meet me there, or not at all. And once I knew where I stood, I chose my moment carefully. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rehearse in it. I waited for a quiet space, one of those ordinary moments that usually slip by unnoticed. We were sitting at the table, coffee growing cold between us. No one in a hurry, no one expecting anything. I said it gently: I need to talk about something. They looked up, not alarmed but surprised. I didn't accuse. I didn't recount every hurt. I said slowly, I've been feeling like decisions are being made about my life without me. The words came out steady, no apology, no edge. I let the silence stretch. It went on longer than I expected. My daughter shifted in her chair. My son stared at his cup. I continued, still calm. I know you're trying to help, I said. I believe that. That mattered to me, to say it honestly. But I'm still here, I went on. I'm still thinking. I'm still capable of deciding for myself. No one interrupted, but no one nodded either. I could feel the discomfort moving through the room, not anger, something heavier: uncertainty. I told them I didn't want conversations about my future happening without me, that I needed to be included, not mentioned afterward. I wasn't asking to take over, I was asking not to be left out. My son finally spoke. He said, "We didn't mean to make you feel that way." It wasn't an argument, it wasn't an agreement either. My daughter looked at me for a moment longer than usual, then said, "Of course." Her voice was careful, measured. We sat there after that. No one rushed to fill the quiet. I felt something shift, not settle, not resolve, just exposed. Because once words like that are spoken out loud, they don't disappear again. They sit in the room, they change the air. I hadn't fixed anything yet, but I had made something clear. And as we finished our coffee in that uneasy silence, I knew this was only the beginning of how things would change, not the end. And after those words were spoken, nothing rushed back into place. That uneasy quiet stayed with us. Over the next few days, I watched my children carefully, not with suspicion but with awareness. Each of them reacted differently. My oldest grew more restrained. He spoke less, chose his words carefully. More than once he started a sentence, then stopped. I felt the pull to smooth it over, to say, "It's okay, forget I said anything." I didn't. My daughter reacted with warmth, but it was tight. She checked in often, asked how I was sleeping, if I needed anything. But underneath it, I could feel her bracing herself, like she was waiting to be corrected or blamed. And my youngest withdrew. Days passed without a call. When he did reach out, his voice was distant, as if he were still deciding how close he wanted to be. None of them argued with me, that surprised me, but none of them moved closer either. Visits felt shorter. I noticed something else then, something small but telling. When the quiet stretched, I didn't rush to fill it. even when it made my chest tighten, even when it would have been easier to apologize. Because I knew what that apology would mean. It would tell them that my honesty was negotiable. Speaking up hadn't brought relief, it had brought distance, but I didn't regret it, because this discomfort, as heavy as it felt, was still lighter than being invisible. This time I was seen, not warmly, not easily, but clearly. And for the first time, I understood the cost of holding your ground. It isn't anger, it's living with the quiet that comes after, and choosing, again and again, not to step back just to make it go away. And once I accepted the quiet that followed my honesty, I stopped asking what my money was worth. I started asking what my life was. For a long time, I'd measured myself by what I provided, how much I gave, how much I carried so others wouldn't have to. Somewhere along the way, that became my value. But sitting in that stillness, with no one rushing in to reassure me or correct me, I saw it clearly. I am not an account balance. I am not a future event. I am the life I am still living. I looked around my house with different eyes then, not as something to be sorted later, but as the place where I still wake up each morning, make my coffee, and decide how my day will go. My worth wasn't waiting in a folder or a plan. It was right there in how I lived my days now. I thought about all the roles I'd filled over the years. Mother, caretaker, the steady one, important roles but not the whole of me. Those roles had seasons, and this season was asking for something quieter, presence, choice. I didn't need to prove my usefulness anymore. I didn't need to be needed to justify my place. That understanding didn't arrive like relief. It arrived like steadiness, the kind that lets you stand without leaning on anyone else. I wasn't turning away from my children, I was turning toward myself. And from that place, I began to see everything through a different lens, not through what I would leave behind, but through how I was living now. And I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it as the woman I am, not the someone else had assigned to me. And once I began seeing my life through that different lens, my days started to look different too. Not in big ways, in quiet ones. I didn't make announcements. I didn't draw lines in the sand. I simply started choosing myself without explaining it. I kept the routines that made me feel steady: morning coffee, a short walk when I could, time spent with books instead of worries. When my children called, I answered, but I no longer rearranged my day to prove my availability. If a visit worked for me, I welcomed it. If it didn't, I said so calmly. I noticed something then. When I didn't rush to please, the world didn't fall apart. Some things grew quieter, some spaces grew wider. My children adjusted in their own ways. Conversations were more careful now, less assuming, still a little awkward, not distant, just changed. I kept my finances private, not hidden, just mine. Decisions were made slowly on my own time. There were moments of sadness. Letting go of old expectations always brings some, but there was also steadiness, the kind that lets you live without constantly checking how you're being received. I wasn't trying to make a point, I was tending to my life. This wasn't withdrawal, it was presence lived quietly day by day. And as that way of living settled in, I understood something important. This wasn't an ending. It was how I would keep going with my place intact and my voice still my own. And now, after everything I've lived through, there's one truth that stays with me. Not advice, not a lesson, just something I learned by living it. You can love your children deeply and still lose your place if you disappear for too long. You can give generously and still be forgotten if you teach others that your needs don't matter. I didn't lose my children because I spoke up. I almost lost myself because I stayed silent. There's a difference. For a long time, I thought being a good mother meant being easy, absorbing things, letting moments pass, keeping the peace. I see now how small that made me feel. You don't stop being a mother when you start being a whole person. And you don't become difficult when you finally take up space in your own life. Some things do change when you do that. Conversations shift, the air feels different, but love doesn't disappear, it just learns new boundaries. I still love my children, that never left, but I live differently now. I don't measure my life by what I'll one day leave behind. I measure it by how honestly I live the days I still have. There are moments of sadness, that's part of it, but there's also a steadiness I didn't have before. I wake up in my own life, I move through my days without shrinking. I'm still here, still living, still choosing. And that, more than any inheritance, more than any number, is what truly belongs to me. I want to say something now that I wish someone had said to me years ago. Not loudly, not in a way that would have embarrassed me, just honestly. Because I know I'm not the only woman who's lived a life like this. I know there are other women listening who have spent decades being the steady one, the one who held everything together without ever being asked if she was tired. We learned early that being low maintenance made life easier for everyone else, that not asking kept the peace, that swallowing hurt was somehow the same thing as being strong. No one ever sat us down and said, "Make sure you don't disappear while you're doing all that." So we did what women like us have always done. We adjusted, we waited, we told ourselves this was just the season of life we were in, and sometimes it lasted longer than we expected. If you're listening to this and you've ever wondered why your voice feels smaller now than it did years ago, I want you to know something. It didn't happen because you failed. It happened because you were generous with parts of yourself no one thought to protect. We gave our time as if it would never run out. We gave our patience as if it couldn't wear thin. We gave our silence thinking it was kindness. And no one warned us that silence, once learned, can become expected. There's a quiet grief that comes with realizing you trained the world to hear you last, not out of selfishness, out of love. And that grief can feel heavy in the later years of life, heavier than regret. Because regret looks backward, grief looks at the present and realizes something is missing. If you've ever felt that ache that doesn't quite have a name, you're not imagining it, and you're not weak for feeling it. You're noticing yourself again. That's all. And I want you to hear this clearly. You are not too much because you finally speak. You are not difficult because you want to be included. You are not selfish because you choose rest over explanation. You are a woman who has lived long enough to know the cost of disappearing, and that knowledge matters. We don't need to become louder to be heard. We don't need to argue. Sometimes all it takes is deciding, quietly, that we will no longer erase ourselves for the comfort of others, that we will sit at our own tables as full participants, that our opinions count even when they complicate things, that our presence is not something to be managed or worked around. If you are still breathing, still thinking, still choosing, your life is not finished. It is not a summary, it is not an inheritance, it is not a future event. It is happening right now. And you are allowed to take up space in it. Not loudly, not angrily. Just honestly. And if no one has told you this lately, let me be the one. You don't owe anyone your silence. You've already given enough.